A date was December 16th, 1944. In the pre-dawn darkness of Monschau, Germany, something extraordinary was about to unfold that would forever change the mathematics of warfare. The frozen earth trembled beneath the boots of advancing German soldiers, but what they could not know was that they were about to encounter a weapon so revolutionary, so devastatingly effective, that it would transform this battle and reshape the very nature of modern combat. This is the untold story of the proximity fuse, America's most closely guarded secret weapon that helped decide the fate of World War II. At precisely 0700 hours, American artillery began its morning barrage, but Colonel Oscar Alfred Axelson of the 406th Artillery Group was about to make one of the most consequential, unauthorized decisions in military history. Against direct orders, without permission from higher command, he ordered his gunners to load shells equipped with the most revolutionary technology in the Allied arsenal. Proximity fuses containing miniature radar systems that could detect their distance from targets and detonate at optimal height for maximum lethality. The shells screamed overhead, but something was terrifyingly, incomprehensibly different. They were not striking the ground or exploding against trees. Instead, they detonated precisely in mid-air, 30 to 50 feet above the advancing German positions, creating a lethal rain of steel fragments that no foxhole, no trench, no defensive position could protect against. Among the 326th Volksgrenadier Division attacking the 38th Cavalry Squadron positions, hardened veterans who had survived years of brutal combat on the Eastern Front encountered something that defied their understanding of warfare. These were not the predictable artillery patterns they knew, the safe zones behind cover, the protective value of entrenchments. This was death, delivered from above, with mathematical precision that no amount of tactical experience could counter. Operation Wacht am Rhein, Hitler's audacious plan to split the Allied armies and recapture the vital port of Antwerp, had begun with tremendous promise. 200,000 German soldiers, 1,000 tanks, and nearly 2,000 artillery pieces had been secretly massed through the fog-shrouded Ardennes, achieving complete tactical surprise that would later be called one of the greatest intelligence failures in American military history. The initial German bombardment at 0530 hours had been devastating. German artillery fired at a rate of 1,600 rounds per minute along an 85-mile front. American frontline units, many composed of green replacements or exhausted veterans sent to this supposedly quiet sector for rest, were caught completely unprepared. But at Monschau, Colonel Axelson faced an impossible tactical situation that would force him to break protocol in the most dramatic way possible. The 38th Cavalry Squadron, a small reconnaissance unit, was being overwhelmed by vastly superior German forces advancing in traditional assault formations. Conventional artillery could not stop the assault. The enemy was too dispersed, too well concealed among the dense forest terrain. In desperation, recognizing that following standard orders meant certain defeat, Axelson made his historic decision to deploy the secret proximity-fused shells without authorization, knowing he could face court-martial for this choice. The effect was immediate and utterly devastating. German soldiers advancing in standard infantry assault formations suddenly found themselves under a type of fire unlike anything they had ever experienced. Each shell exploded 30 to 50 feet above them, creating expanding cones of supersonic fragments that covered vastly more lethal area than conventional ground-burst shells. Veterans who instinctively knew how to take cover from normal artillery were cut down in their foxholes, behind trees, in ditches, anywhere they sought traditional shelter, had become a death trap. The proximity fuse represented the convergence of American scientific innovation and industrial capacity operating at their absolute peak of wartime efficiency. Unlike conventional shells that required direct impact or unreliable time fuses that often detonated at incorrect heights, Each proximity fuse contained a complete radar system no larger than a coffee can, packed with 130 electronic components and 4 to 5 miniature vacuum tubes that could withstand the incredible 20,000 times gravity force generated when fired from an artillery piece. The physics involved were absolutely staggering for 1944 technology. At the moment of firing, the tremendous acceleration would crush a glass ampule containing electrolyte, creating a battery that powered the tiny radar system throughout the shell's flight duration. Dr. Merle Tuve at Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory had driven this development with Manhattan Project-level intensity and secrecy. The laboratory, carefully disguised as an abandoned used car dealership in Silver Spring, Maryland, employed 3% of all American physicists at peak production. Security protocols matched those of the atomic bomb program. Workers could not discuss their work, even with immediate family members, and each fuse carried a unique serial number for complete tracking from factory to battlefield. The technical challenges had initially seemed completely insurmountable. Vacuum tubes designed for living room radios had to be entirely redesigned to survive being fired from cannons while maintaining sensitivity to detect targets without premature detonation. The breakthrough came through revolutionary miniaturization techniques that would later transform the entire electronics industry. Dr. James Van Allen created vacuum tubes no larger than pencil erasers that contained all elements of conventional radio tubes. By December 1944, American factories were producing 40,000 proximity fuses daily, with ruthless quality control that exceeded anything previously attempted in mass production. Axelson's unauthorized use on December 16th created an immediate command crisis that reverberated through Supreme Headquarters. He had directly violated orders restricting proximity fuses to anti-aircraft use only, based on fears that captured examples might be reverse-engineered by German scientists. However, the devastating effectiveness at Monschau was absolutely undeniable. The German attack had been stopped completely, with casualties that shocked commanders on both sides. Word of the weapon's incredible impact reached Supreme Headquarters within hours. General Eisenhower, fully recognizing the desperate situation developing across the entire Ardennes front, formally requested authorization on December 19th. By December 21st, all restrictions were completely lifted, and proximity fuses were released for general ground combat use across the entire Battle of the Bulge battlefield. The rapid distribution that followed demonstrated American logistical superiority in dramatic fashion. Within days, proximity fuse shells were being delivered to artillery units throughout the Ardennes. The 463rd Parachute Field Artillery Battalion at Bastogne received their allocation just as the German encirclement closed around the town. The 420th Armored Field Artillery Battalion began using them to defend the northwest approaches with their M7 Priest self-propelled howitzers. The siege of Bastogne provided the perfect demonstration of proximity fuses in defensive warfare against determined enemy assault. The 101st Airborne Division, completely surrounded and significantly outnumbered, held the vital crossroads against repeated German attacks with ferocious determination. Their artillery support included the 463rd Parachute Field Artillery Battalion, equipped with 75mm pack howitzers capable of firing proximity-fused shells with devastating accuracy. Between December 19th and 31st, the 463rd fired exactly 7,676 rounds, according to official unit records. While not all were proximity-fused due to limited supply constraints, those that were had devastating psychological and physical effects on attacking German formations. Entire assault companies simply melted away under the precise airburst barrages, with entire platoons eliminated in seconds by the expanding fragment patterns. The December 22nd attack, launched immediately following General McAuliffe's legendary nuts reply to the German surrender demand, showcased the weapon's tactical effectiveness in dramatic fashion. German infantry advancing across snow-covered fields in traditional formations were caught completely exposed in the open terrain. The proximity-fused shells detonated overhead with precise timing, creating overlapping patterns of destruction that left absolutely no safe zones for advancing troops. The all-African-American 969th Artillery Battalion played an equally crucial defensive role under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Hubert Barnes. Their 155mm howitzers created an impenetrable ring of death around Bastion's entire perimeter that advancing German forces found completely insurmountable. The larger shells, detonating at 50 feet altitude, covered even greater areas with lethal fragments traveling at supersonic velocities. Perhaps the most thoroughly documented demonstration of proximity fuse lethality occurred at the Sauer River near Ardennes on December 25th to 26th. General George Patton, whose Third Army was driving north to relieve surrounding Bastogne, personally witnessed this engagement and recorded it in vivid detail in his memoir, War as I Knew It. A complete German battalion attempted to cross the partially frozen river, believing they were concealed by darkness and thick fog from American forward observers. Traditional artillery would have required careful adjustment of fire, giving the Germans sufficient time to complete their dangerous crossing or seek adequate cover. However, proximity-fused shells required no such time-consuming adjustment procedures. Patton wrote, with characteristic directness, "We caught a German battalion crossing the Sauer. The new proximity ammunition was absolutely devastating. The shells burst in the air directly above them. They had nowhere to run, the river behind them, our fire in front and above. When the firing stopped, we counted 702 bodies." This figure, 702 killed by actual count, represents one of the few precisely documented casualty figures from proximity fuse employment during the entire war. The mathematical efficiency was stark and undeniable. A single battalion essentially ceased to exist within minutes, with no possibility of escape or effective defense against the overhead bursting pattern. The Ardennes dense forests, which German commanders counted on for concealment and protection, became death traps when proximity fuses entered the tactical equation. In open terrain, a proximity fuse detonating at 30 to 50 feet was deadly enough. However, in heavily forested areas, the lethal effects multiplied exponentially through secondary fragmentation. The air bursts shattered tree branches, creating thousands of additional wooden projectiles traveling at hundreds of feet per second with lethal velocity. These splinters, some as long as a man's arm, combined with steel fragments to create 360-degree till zones that traditional defensive tactics could not counter. Taking cover behind large trees or digging foxholes under root systems became completely useless against fragments and splinters coming from directly above. A single proximity-fused 155mm shell detonating above the forest canopy could clear an area the size of a tennis court of all living things through the combined effect of metal fragments and wooden splinters. German units extensively trained in forest warfare found their hard-earned expertise completely worthless against this revolutionary threat. The proximity fuse operated on principles that seemed like science fiction to soldiers in 1944. Each fuse contained a tiny radio transmitter operating at 180 to 220 megahertz, continuously sending out waves that reflected off any objects, ground, trees, vehicles, or human bodies. As the shell approached its intended target, the reflected signal strengthened proportionally. When it reached predetermined intensity corresponding to optimal burst height, an electronic switch triggered instantaneous detonation. The entire sophisticated system had to function perfectly under conditions that would destroy normal electronics completely. During firing, acceleration reached 20,000 times Earth's gravity, sufficient force to crush a human body to microscopic thickness. The shells spun at rates, creating massive centrifugal forces, while enduring temperature ranges from gun barrel heat of 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit to sub-zero conditions at trajectory peak. Yet the delicate vacuum tubes, protected by revolutionary cushioning systems developed specifically for this application, survived and functioned with over 80% reliability under these extreme conditions. The optimal burst heights had been determined through extensive testing at Aberdeen Proving Ground: 30 feet for 105mm howitzers, 50 feet for 155mm guns, and 70+ feet for the rare 240mm shells capable of clearing entire grid squares. The German intelligence failure regarding proximity fuses proved absolutely catastrophic for their war effort. In December 1944, Wehrmacht forces overran an American ammunition depot, capturing approximately 20,000 proximity-fused shells, an intelligence windfall that should have led to immediate countermeasure development and tactical adaptation. Instead, German technical experts examined the captured fuses and declared them technologically impossible. The presence of vacuum tubes in artillery shells contradicted everything German engineers believed about electronics surviving ballistic forces. They concluded the Americans were using some unknown form of magnetic detection, or that the visible components were elaborate decoys concealing the real mechanism. This catastrophic failure stemmed partly from institutional blindness within German scientific establishments. Germany had actually led proximity fuse development before the war, with Rheinmetall Borsig and AEG Berlin producing working prototypes by 1940. However, Hitler's direct order canceling all weapons projects, requiring more than 6 months to reach production, had terminated the entire program, leaving German engineers unable to believe Americans had solved problems they themselves had abandoned. December 25, 1944 brought no holiday respite from the devastating effectiveness of proximity-fused artillery. German units attempting to use Christmas for resupply and reorganization discovered that proximity fuses recognized no ceasefires or seasonal traditions. Field kitchens, supply convoys, and assembly areas came under devastating bombardment that required no forward observers to achieve pinpoint accuracy. The 420th Armored Field Artillery Battalion alone fired over 1,000 rounds on Christmas Day, with most being proximity fused for maximum anti-personnel effect. Their M7 Priest self-propelled howitzers delivered rapid, accurate fire that caught German units completely unprepared for such intense bombardment during what they assumed would be a quiet holiday period. The ability to fire effectively without direct observation, in poor weather conditions, and during darkness, transformed artillery from primarily a daylight weapon into a 24-hour threat that provided no sanctuary for enemy forces. The psychological impact proved severe among German troops, who had learned to move during poor weather when Allied aircraft could not fly and forward observers could not effectively spot targets. On December 21st, SS Colonel Otto Skorzény's elite commandos, the same soldiers who had rescued Mussolini and nearly captured Marshal Tito, attempted to capture the strategic town of Malmedy. These were not ordinary Wehrmacht soldiers, but specially selected troops representing the absolute best Germany could field, trained to the highest standards and equipped with American uniforms for infiltration purposes. They encountered devastating proximity-fused artillery fire that transformed their carefully planned American disguises from tactical advantage into death shrouds. The shells exploded overhead with uncanny precision, as if they possessed supernatural ability to detect the imposters below. The attack failed catastrophically, with heavy casualties that effectively ended Skorzény's offensive operations in the Ardennes sector. The psychological breakdown among these elite SS troops proved particularly significant for German morale. Soldiers indoctrinated with beliefs in German technological and tactical superiority, trained to the highest military standards, found themselves completely helpless against American scientific advancement. Some survivors reportedly charged directly toward American lines, preferring quick death to continued bombardment, representing complete breakdown of military discipline among Hitler's most fanatical troops. General George Patton understood proximity fuse's revolutionary value better than perhaps any Allied commander in the European theater. His Third Army, driving north to relieve surrounded Bastogne, employed them as breakthrough weapons with devastating tactical effectiveness. His artillery commander, Brigadier General Edward Williams, developed entirely new tactics specifically designed for proximity fuse employment on the modern battlefield. Williams pioneered the time-on-target concentration technique using proximity fuses, where multiple artillery battalions fired simultaneously so dozens of shells arrived together at precisely the same moment. When proximity-fused shells detonated simultaneously at optimal height, the combined effect was described by German survivors as the bell toll of death, an apocalyptic concentration of firepower that no defensive measures could withstand. In the critical week between December 22nd and 29th, Patton's Third Army fired 50,000 proximity-fused shells, with results that proved decisive in breaking German resistance and opening the vital corridor to surrounded Bastogne. Patton himself wrote with characteristic bluntness, "The funny fuse won the Battle of the Bulge for us." Cheek. The Battle of the Bulge officially ended on January 25, 1945, with German forces in complete retreat toward the Rhine. Hitler's last great offensive had cost Germany approximately 100,000 casualties, while achieving absolutely nothing strategically. American losses totaled 75,000, including 19,000 killed, but the proximity fuse had proven itself not merely as an improved artillery round, but as a genuine war-winning technology. The statistical analysis reveals proximity fuse's decisive strategic impact. 200,000 proximity-fused shells were fired during the battle, accounting for an estimated 15,000 to 20,000 German casualties, representing up to 20% of total German losses from a revolutionary weapon that comprised only a fraction of total ammunition expended. General Eisenhower's post-war assessment that German possession of proximity fuses might have made D-Day exceedingly difficult, perhaps impossible, underscores their revolutionary strategic importance. They represented not merely an artillery improvement, but a fundamental transformation that changed warfare's essential mathematics through the application of advanced scientific principles to battlefield problems. The proximity fuse program generated technological advances that completely transformed post-war civilian and military applications. The miniaturized vacuum tubes became foundational elements for modern electronics development. Quality control procedures established for fuse production became industry-wide standards that revolutionized manufacturing processes. The organizational methods for coordinating hundreds of suppliers pioneered modern supply chain management techniques, still used today. Dr. James Van Allen applied his revolutionary miniaturization expertise to satellite instrumentation, later discovering Earth's radiation belts that bear his name. The radar principles evolved into all modern detection systems. The fundamental concept of autonomous sensors making targeting decisions became the foundation for guided missiles and eventually all precision-guided munitions that dominate contemporary warfare. Every smart weapon deployed on modern battlefields descends directly from the proximity fuse, the first weapon system that could sense its environment and autonomously choose when to detonate for maximum effectiveness. The technological revolution that began in the frozen forests of the Ardennes continues shaping military affairs today, where autonomous systems increasingly determine battlefield outcomes. From Colonel Axelson's unauthorized first use on December 16, 1944, through the systematic deployment of 200,000 shells across the Ardennes battlefield, proximity fuses demonstrated conclusively that scientific innovation could provide decisive military advantage when properly applied with industrial scale and tactical imagination. The proximity fuse story ultimately represents transformation, technological, tactical, and profoundly human. It proved that industrial democracy could produce weapons of devastating effectiveness, that innovation could overcome numerical disadvantage, and that the side with superior science and manufacturing capability would likely prevail in modern technological warfare. In those frozen forests of the Ardennes, the age of truly technological warfare arrived with mathematical precision. The German soldiers who died beneath proximity-fused airbursts were casualties not merely of a particular battle, but of a complete revolution in military affairs that continues shaping our world today. The mathematics of death were permanently rewritten by tiny radar sets contained in artillery shells, forever changing how nations wage war and defend themselves in an increasingly complex world.